The hall is quiet now, but I want you to imagine it as it once was. Stone walls rising into darkness, their rough faces catching the glow of torches, the scent of smoke and roasting meat drifting lazily through the air, mingling with the sweeter perfume of honeyed wine and cinnamon-dusted pastries. Wooden tables stretch the length of the room, draped in embroidered cloths and piled high with steaming platters. There's a hum in the air, the soft murmur of servants gliding between benches, the scrape of a ladle against a pot, the faint thud of a knife splitting a roast. It feels warm here, safe perhaps, but this table, like so many through history, hides its dangers in plain sight. Food is meant to be life. Bread to fill your belly, meat to keep you strong, wine to warm you. And yet, history has taught us a strange and uncomfortable truth. Food has also been one of humanity's oldest, most efficient killers. Sometimes it was deliberate. A pinch of arsenic stirred into a goblet of wine, a mushroom picked with malicious intent, a pie delivered to a rival's table with a smile that masked death. Other times, the killing came without malice, born on mold spores, on the flesh of spoiled fish, in the milk from a sick cow. The eater never knew until the pain began. In Europe, for centuries, the act of sitting down to eat could be as dangerous as marching onto a battlefield. The dangers hid in banquets and in peasant stews, in the kitchens of kings and the smoky hearths of farmers. The wealthy might meet their end through exotic delicacies, brought in from faraway lands, dishes. No one in their court truly understood how to prepare safely. The poor might fall victim to desperation, forced to eat bread stretched with sawdust, meat long past its safe hour, or roots pulled from the ground without knowing they carried poison. I want you to picture the breadth of it. The glittering halls of the Vatican, where popes and cardinals sipped from golden goblets, unaware or perhaps all too aware that one wrong sip might be their last. The cramped stone kitchens of a medieval fortress, where a sweating cook stirred a pot for a dozen nights and never noticed the fleck of deadly mushroom drifting in with the herbs. The bustling market squares, where barrels of salted fish once fresh had turned sour in the sun, but would be sold anyway, their smell disguised with spices. The thing about deadly food is that it rarely looks deadly. Poison doesn't need to taste bitter. Spoilage can hide under a glaze of honey. Even the most lethal fungi can resemble the gentle mushrooms we fry in butter today. That's what made it so insidious, so perfectly dangerous. It was a killer that arrived dressed as a gift. And when it came to royal courts and political enemies, that disguise was all too useful. You might wonder, was it really so common? More than we like to think. Across European history, food has been a political weapon, a tool of quiet murder, and a hazard of simple ignorance. And the tragedies it caused are still there, if you know where to look, inked into the margins of royal chronicles, whispered in village legends, buried in medical records that read more like crime reports. We'll wander through them together. Some stories will take us into grand banquets lit by 100 candles, where the air is thick with perfume and roasted pheasant, and a single dish will decide the fate of a kingdom. Others will take us into cold, hungry winters, where desperate hands reached for anything to chew and found death instead. Sometimes the killers will be human, sometimes they'll be nature itself, and sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. For tonight, let your mind settle into the shadows of this long table. Imagine the clink of a goblet, the warm waft of bread fresh from the oven, the gleam of a roasted goose under dripping fat. Every detail beckons you to eat. But beneath that welcome, history is waiting to remind us. Not every meal was meant to nourish. Some were meant to destroy. It began, as so many tragedies do, with something that should have been safe. In August of 1951, the little French town of Pont-Saint-Esprit woke under a warm, late summer sun. The morning air was sweet with the smell of baking bread from the village boulangerie, a smell that had always promised comfort. Housewives lined up at the counter, coins ready, baskets waiting for warm loaves wrapped in paper. Bakers, proud of their craft, worked with the same flour and water, the same yeast and salt they had used for years. There was no sign, no strange scent or taste, to warn them that this bread would carry madness. By evening, the streets were no longer calm. A woman screamed of tigers leaping at her from the walls. Men tore at their clothes, running through the town with wild eyes. A child tried to strangle his mother. Villagers claimed the bread was alive, crawling with serpents only they could see. 7 people would die. Dozens more would be taken away to hospitals, some never to return to themselves. The newspapers called it le pain maudit, the cursed bread. The cause has been argued ever since. Some say ergot fungus, a parasite of rye, had slipped into the flour, releasing a poison that twists the brain into hallucination. Others whisper darker theories, Cold War experiments, chemicals slipped into the grain by unseen hands. But whatever the truth, Pont Saint-Esprit became a modern echo of an older terror, one that had haunted Europe for centuries. In the Middle Ages, ergot was no mystery. Villagers knew its black, claw-like growths on rye stalks by sight, but they did not always have the luxury to discard infected grain. In times of famine, anything that could be ground and baked was precious, and so the fungus found its way into bread, unleashing what they called St. Anthony's fire. It began with a tingling in the fingers and toes. Then came the burning, an inner fire that made sufferers claw at their skin, desperate to cool themselves. Some felt their limbs harden, as if the flesh itself were turning to wood. In the worst cases, gangrene took hold, blackening hands and feet until they fell away. Others suffered the madness. Visions of demons, wild laughter, frantic dancing that could last until death. From French monasteries to German market towns, whole communities would be struck at once, their fields and granaries cursed by an enemy too small to see. Pilgrims would walk or be carried to shrines of St. Anthony, seeking the saint's mercy. They left behind offerings, sometimes the very blackened limbs that the disease had claimed as proof of the suffering they had endured. For kings and nobles, ergot poisoning was not merely a rustic misfortune. A royal army fed on tainted bread could be rendered useless in days, collapsing not to swords, but to a sickness from within. There are whispers in court, chronicles of campaigns lost not to battle, but to the fire. When soldiers dropped their shields to scratch their burning skin or wandered into enemy lines, raving of beasts no one else could see. What links the bread of Pont Saint-Esprit to the rye of the Middle Ages is more than just the fungus itself. It is the reminder that food, the thing we trust most, can become a silent traitor. A loaf can cradle comfort or cradle death, and history does not always warn us which it will be. The villagers of 1951 did not know they were stepping into the same nightmare their ancestors had faced centuries before. The faces of the afflicted eyes wide, skin slick with sweat, mouths full of cries that made no sense would have been familiar to any medieval healer. The madness passes, the bodies heal, but the shadow that falls on a community after such a night never truly lifts. Let me take you into a chamber of soft lamplight and polished wood, where gold-edged plates rest on linen and the hush of expectation gathers like breath on glass. Imagine the long tables set within a Swedish castle hall, Uppsala's pale stone watching from the windows, winter pressing its cool hand against the leaded panes. Candles flitter, silver knives gleam. Courtiers murmur in the gentle music of ceremony. A toast is raised, a cup passes, and the first course arrives with that comforting weight of ritual. Now, lean closer. At certain banquets in certain years, poison moved with the same grace as the servants, unseen, unhurried, certain. Some later tellings speak of an Uppsala wedding feast in the 1570s gilded dishes, lutes, and sly smiles where nobles sickened before the night was out. You'll hear it whispered as 1572, fixed to Uppsala, so the mind can picture stone, fire, and snow. But when we set the story gently on the historian's table and examine its seams, the threads begin to show. Contemporary records for that specific Uppsala wedding poisoning are scarce to vanishing, and Swedish chronicle, keepers so meticulous with scandal, do not give us a clean, documented scene to point to on that exact year and place. What we do have, uncomfortably close in time and space, are other Swedish moments soaked in fear and food. In 1567, at Uppsala Castle itself, King Eric XIV's mind unravelled into blood. No banquet then, but a violent night remembered as the Sture murders, a reminder that Uppsala's halls have seen death scripted into power's theatre. And a few winters later, in 1577, the deposed king died in captivity at Urbihus. When his remains were examined centuries on, they told a quiet tale the court never could. Arsenic, almost certainly, the final guest at his table. Apocrypha sometimes clings to the correct walls, even when it names the wrong room. The myth of a poisoned Uppsala banquet may be a shadow cast by real flames nearby panic in the castle a decade earlier, and arsenic in a king's bowl not long after. The details drift, as they do in all old houses. The lesson remains. In that world of embers and powdered spices, a feast could be a battlefield laid flat. For the Sture murders at Uppsala, for Eric XIV's likely arsenic death, and for Urbihus, see modern summaries of the events and forensic findings. For the legend of royal banquet betrayals, compare with authenticated Swedish crises of 1567, 1577. So let us set the rumour gently aside, like a cracked goblet, and turn our eyes to a killer that did visit European tables, with documentary certainty, one dressed as an autumn treasure, one so beautiful that even emperors and poets praised the idea of it. Mushrooms. Not the humble field caps safely fried in butter, but their grave-robed cousins, the death cap, Amanita phalloides, and the pallid, deceptively pure destroying angels, Amanita verosa and A. verna. Picture a basket in a damp beechwood after rain, the air cool and mineral, the leaves soft with rot. A hand reaches down, a pale stem, a flawless white gill, a cap that seems painted with moonlight. It looks clean, almost medicinal, so unlike the riotous colours of toadstools children are warned away from, and that is precisely the problem. The deadliest mushrooms in Europe wear the face of innocence. The toxin they carry, amatoxins, are small, stubborn molecules, indifferent to fire and stubborn against time. Roast them, boil them, stew them into a fragrant sauce over partridge, and the poison remains, patient as stone. 6 to 12 hours after the meal, just long enough for the family to remark that the dish was surprisingly good, a cold hand takes the stomach and does not let go. Vomiting, cramps like iron rings. Then, a strange, false dawn, the symptoms ease, hope returns, and people try to sleep. But deep inside, the liver has begun to die in silence. The second wave arrives like tide under moon. Jaundice threads the eyes, confusion clouds the voice, and by the time the household understands what this is, time itself has left the table. With the death cap, even half a cap can be enough to turn a night into an epitaph. For medical and historical detail on Amanita phalloides and destroying angels, their toxins, symptoms, and notorious role in European poisonings, see standard references. History gives us names that might have felt that cold tide. Roman rumour fastened itself to Emperor Claudius, the story of a plate of mushrooms offered with imperial courtesy and finished with imperial finality. Century later, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles VI, died after eating mushrooms in 1740, an illness that tore through him with such speed and cruelty that later readers have wondered whether the plate brought him a botanist's mistake or a courtier's intention. Were these cases definitively Amanita? The archives whisper rather than shout, and historians must keep their footing on that mossy ground. But the pattern deadly fungi at elite tables, the slow-blooming crisis, the familiar choreography of hope and collapse has repeated often enough in documented households that the story's bones feel grimly familiar. For the widely repeated associations of death cap with Claudius and the fatal mushroom illness of Charles VI, see modern summaries of Amanita's deadly record. It was not only palaces that fell to these pale assassins. Parish registers across Europe, especially in forested belts, carry cool entries that translate to grief. The family perished after eating wild fungi. In the north, where summers are brief and autumns fragrant, foragers often learned by the hardest of schools. The destroying angel's trick is not only its beauty, but its resemblance to edible species. The young buttons can be mistaken for puffballs when sliced carelessly, and caps for harmless field mushrooms when gathered in failing light. A grandmother's confident hand, a child's eager basket, a skillet that sings at sundown, these were the settings of tragedies that never made a chronicle, only a churchyard. Modern field guides teach the shape of doom, the vulva or cup at the base of the stem, the skirt-like ring, the white gills that refuse to darken with age, but such careful knowledge was not always in reach for hungry families. And even for the learned, the forest keeps its ambiguities. For identification features and survival warnings recorded by European naturalists and conservation bodies, see accessible guides to poisonous UK and European fungi. Lean with me a moment into a Renaissance kitchen where copper pans gleam and a scullion crushes herbs with a pestle. A noble's hunt has been successful, birds lie plucked on the board, and the cook wants a sauce fit for a patron's praise. A servant boy has returned from a glade with a handful of pale mushrooms, angel white, he calls them, proud of his find. The cook's nose is good for wine, not mycology. Into the pan they go with cream, pepper, and a little nutmeg. By midnight, the manor is whispering with footsteps on staircases, chamber pots, groans muffled by doors. By dawn, the village priest is sent for. There is a reason the Italian language knows the phrase funghi velenosi as intimately as it knows the recipes of nonna. There is a reason old French herbalists wrote of champignons that se donnant à manger aux ennemis. Mushrooms in Europe are love and danger shelved together in the same pantry. And here is a smaller, sharper scene. A travelling scholar hosted by a provincial canon in the 17th century. They dine modestly bread, a wedge of cheese, a dish of woodland mushrooms in butter. The canon eats sparingly. The traveller is hungry from the road. He sleeps poorly, rises worse, and by afternoon a doctor has been sent. The churchman survives. The guest does not. In a dozen letters preserved in ecclesiastical archives, you find phrases trimmed of drama but fat with sorrow. He supped with us and was taken suddenly. The mushrooms were ill, chosen. We held prayers through the night. These quiet notes are the edges of a map with too many blank spaces, each blank a life that left no more than a line of ink. Why, you might wonder, did such deaths persist for centuries? Because food is trust, and trust is stubborn. Because hunger sweetens risk. Because hospitality makes it hard to refuse. And because the very idea of a mushroom that it sprouts from earth like a benediction after rain suggests generosity rather than betrayal. The death cap and the destroying angel are truest to their names when the human heart is generous. When a neighbor brings a gift, when a host wishes to impress, when a grandmother teaches a grandchild the forest's secrets, they are, in a cruel way, social poisons. Return now, briefly, to Sweden, where we began. If there was not, in fact, a clean ledger entry for an Uppsala wedding mass poisoning in 1572, there were other treacheries in that decade, and they taught the same lesson. Uppsala's halls held a king's disorder and noble's blood. A few winters' march away, a dethroned monarch likely swallowed his last meal laced with arsenic, a powder as common in early modern Europe as salt in a cellar. The banquet as a murder stage is not a fairy tale there. It is a practice with receipts, names, and, in Eric XIV's case, bones that centuries later still spoke. Put the rumour beside the proof, and together they say, in rooms of music and candlelight, death often preferred a seat near the salt cellar. For the king's poisoning and the context of Uppsala's violent 1560s, see standard histories. For the Nyköping banquet of 1317, a royal feast that became a trap rather than a poisoning note, how Swedish memory binds food, treachery, and power. And so, as the last candle trembles, keep the two images side by side, a courtly board where rumour and arsenic move with the same poise, and a forest edge where an ivory white cap waits in moss like a saint's relic, carrying within it the cold arithmetic of amatoxin. One shows what men will do to one another in the language of food. The other shows what the earth will do without intention, and how easily we misunderstand its grammar. If you listen, you can almost hear the soft scrape of a spoon at a royal table and the faint sound of rain on leaves in a northern wood. The flavors are different. The outcome is the same. The hall is quieter now. The clatter of trenchers has faded, and the servants, moving like shadows, bring in the evening's final pots. This is not a grand wedding or a coronation feast. No gold plate, no musicians in the gallery, just the comfortable murmur of a noble household in Tudor England, the smell of wood smoke in the rafters, and the heavy, rich steam rising from the kitchen. The centerpiece of the meal is not a spit-roasted boar or a peacock in full feather, but something humbler, a thick pea pottage. It is a food that belongs to the working day as much as to the feast board, the kind of dish that could be prepared in advance and kept warm over embers for hours. Yet in 1551, in the heart of England, a bowl of such pottage became a silent weapon. The chronicles call it the poisoned pea porridge, and the story has survived because the death it carried did not come quietly. Guests, respectable and high in the county, gathered for what should have been an unremarkable supper. They ate, they drank, they talked about the weather and the latest mutterings from London, but before the meal was done, the first stomach cramps began. Before dawn, bodies were laid out, the laughter replaced by groans and prayers. We do not have the forensics of a modern coroner's office to tell us precisely what poisoned that pot. Theories have wandered. Arsenic slipped in by a rival's spoiled meat stock hidden in the broth, even toxic herbs mistaken for flavouring greens. But the shadow that hangs over it is political. In the years after the English Reformation, England's counties were threaded with quiet feuds, families divided by religion, old allegiances gnawing under new loyalties. Poison was a tool that required no army, no public scandal, only a moment in the kitchen when the wrong hand was near the pot. What makes the 1551 pottage incident so unsettling is how ordinary it must have felt until it didn't. A meal shared with friends, a dish that was as much comfort as sustenance, and yet one taste carried death. In that, it stands for dozens of similar moments lost to record. Banquets in manor halls, Sunday dinners in rectories, market day stews in busy inns, where the line between nourishment and fatality was measured in a single spoonful. And from England, let us carry our steps north, through the chill Baltic winds, to Sweden, where another royal table offered a different kind of death, not swift and sinister, but sweet, slow, and chosen. It was February of 1771, and King Adolf Frederick of Sweden sat down to what history has politely called a sumptuous meal. The details have been recorded not by rumour, but by amused and scandalized chroniclers. A starter of lobster, caviar, and sauerkraut, washed down with champagne. Then came the dish for which the king had an almost childlike fondness, semla buns. These were soft wheat rolls, hollowed and filled with a mixture of warm milk, sugar, and almond paste. Today they are a gentle indulgence, a winter treat enjoyed before Lent. But on that day, the king did not stop at 1, or 3, or even 10. Accounts say he ate 14 semla buns, each served in its bowl of hot milk after a heavy multi-course feast. There was no poison here, no malice from a court rival, only gluttony, and perhaps the fatal pride of a monarch, accustomed to taking what he wished from the table. By the end of the evening, the king complained of cramps, and by nightfall, apoplexy had taken him. Died of digestion, the Swedish people would later say, with a mixture of sorrow and dark humour. There is a temptation to see Adolf Frederick's death as ridiculous, a man felled by desert, but beneath the comedy is a truth about food's power over the human body. The rich diet of European courts in the 18th century was a luxury born of empire and trade, heavy with sugar, cream, refined flour, and imported spices. The very foods that symbolize status also burdened the heart, thickened the blood, and in some cases hastened the end. The king's demise also reminds us that in the catalogue of history's food-related deaths, not every entry is a tale of malice. Some are simply the result of abundance meeting appetite. of a table too well stocked for the health of the one seated at its head. In this, the semler buns of 1771 share a strange kinship with the poisoned pottage of 1551. Both show how easily trust in food, whether prepared by a loyal cook or brought in on golden platters, can become a step toward the grave. The pottage asks us to imagine treachery in the kitchen. The semler asks us to imagine the kitchen itself as treachery, when it indulges every royal whim without question. In both cases, the meal becomes the executioner, and the dining table becomes the scaffold. And so, as the candles burn low in these two distant halls, one in Tudor England, one in Gustavian Sweden, we are left with the same image: a man or woman seated in confidence, lifting a spoon or fork with no thought that it might be the last. The warmth of the food, the company of the table, the comfort of tradition, none of these can be trusted when history decides to slip death between the courses. The waters of the Venetian lagoon shimmered in the soft light of dusk, reflecting the gilded windows of merchant palaces. Gondolas slid silently under the Rialto, their oars making slow arcs against the fading glow. Venice, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, was a city of contradictions, a republic built on trade, diplomacy, and espionage. Its marble halls and painted ceilings concealed an undercurrent of treachery, where enemies could be undone as easily with a whisper as with a blade. And sometimes the deadliest blows came not in the open piazza, but in the private intimacy of the dining table. Wine was the lifeblood of Venetian society. It accompanied every deal, every treaty, every marriage negotiation. Malvasia from Greece, Trebbiano from the mainland, rich red Vernaccia from the Tuscan hills, the Republic's merchants brought the best vintages into the city, and the nobility drank deeply. But wine was also a perfect delivery system for something far more dangerous. In an era without chemical testing, a poisoner could lace a goblet with powdered arsenic, crushed cantharides, or even ground glass, and the victim's death might be written off as apoplexy or a sudden fever. The archives of the Council of Ten, Venice's most feared governing body, record chilling hints of such methods. On 13 June 1513, a merchant named Pietro Loredan was summoned after being accused of plotting to alter the health of a rival by serving him vino corretto, altered wine. The case was quietly dropped, likely because it implicated a member of a powerful patrician family, but the phrase vino corretto appears again and again in the records, a euphemism everyone understood. Sometimes the killers were not nobles but hired hands, cupbearers, and servants who could be bribed to pour from a different decanter or slip something into a chalice before it reached the lips of the intended target. Arsenic was the poison of choice. Tasteless in small quantities and easily masked by strong, spiced wines, it could kill slowly or swiftly, depending on the dose. The Venetian spice trade made it even easier to hide. In the bustling markets of the Rialto, powdered arsenic might be sold under the cover of rat medicine or mixed with cinnamon and clove. Once slipped into a cup, it left no obvious mark, only stomach pains, vomiting, and eventually death. Another favourite, though less reliable, was powdered diamond or ground glass. Though far less potent chemically, these sharp particles could lacerate the digestive tract, leading to infection, bleeding, and slow decline. Venice's political climate made such methods especially tempting. The Republic's patrician families, the Moccanigo, the Loredan, the Foscari, were locked in constant competition for offices and influence. A death at the right moment could open a coveted seat in the Senate or remove a dangerous voice from the Great Council. In 1507, a case involving the wealthy merchant Andrea Barbarigo surfaced when a letter to his brother hinted that the wine will serve its purpose before the week is out. No formal charges were ever brought, but Barbarigo's rival in a disputed trade deal died within days of a private dinner at his home. The Venetians were not alone in this. The shadow of Rome loomed nearby, and the Borgia family had already earned a reputation for their rumoured poison, Cantarella, said to be a slow-acting mixture of arsenic and other ingredients. Whether the Borgias truly perfected such a recipe is debated, but their notoriety influenced Italian political culture. The notion that power could be preserved or extended with a single poisoned toast was widely accepted, and Venice, ever pragmatic, was willing to employ similar methods when it suited the Republic's needs. Yet, the dangers of the table were not confined to wine. Across Europe, another threat could lurk on the silver platters carried into banquet halls. Fish. In an age when exotic imports were prized above all, the rare and the unusual were the greatest show of wealth. Among the deadliest of these was the pufferfish. While most Europeans had never seen the living creature, dried or preserved specimens reached Mediterranean ports through trade networks stretching from the Levant and beyond. Some were brought intentionally, others arrived mixed with other preserved fish in bulk shipments. Few in Europe knew how to prepare them safely. Tetrodotoxin, the pufferfish's lethal defense, is a neurotoxin more potent than cyanide. It leaves its victims fully conscious but unable to move or breathe. Medieval chroniclers, lacking the knowledge to explain such paralysis, sometimes described it as a demonic affliction or divine punishment. There are fragmentary records from Genoese and Venetian port authorities in the late 14th and early 15th centuries warning against certain fish from the Levant which bring death in the belly. Such warnings suggest that at least a handful of incidents had already occurred. Closer to home, more familiar species could also prove deadly. Salted herring, cod, and sturgeon were staples of fasting days, shipped in large quantities from the North Sea and Baltic. If improperly cured, they could harbour the bacteria Clostridium botulinum, causing what we now call botulism. Without refrigeration, the risk was high, especially in warmer climates. In 1483, the Bruges city records note the sudden deaths of several foreign merchants after a shared meal of imported fish. The chronicler writes, "They fell stricken at table, unable to speak, their faces pale as wax, and within hours they were gone. Even freshwater catches could betray their diners." In parts of Central Europe, pike and perch caught during late summer could accumulate toxins from algae blooms in their lakes. While most cases likely went unrecorded, outbreaks of fish fevers were noted in Bavaria and Bohemia, where entire households sickened after a single shared meal. In the medieval kitchen, where fish was often gently stewed in wine or broth rather than seared at high temperatures, many toxins could survive the cooking process intact. The danger was compounded by the medieval love of elaborate presentation. Fish might be cooked whole, stuffed with herbs, and served with the skin intact, meaning any contamination in the viscera could easily mix with the flesh. And because food was shared from communal platters, a single bad specimen could poison dozens. But in the mind of a courtier or a rival, such accidents could be seen as opportunities. A spoiled fish could always be arranged, and blame left to the market or the catch. Thus, the table in Renaissance and medieval Europe was never just a place of hospitality. In Venice, a host's smile might conceal the fact that your goblet was different from everyone else's. In Bruges, a merchant's generosity in sharing his fish might be the last kindness you received. And in every port, from the lagoons of the Adriatic to the estuaries of the Thames, the banquet could be a theatre of death. Wine and fish, symbols of the sea, of trade, of abundance, were also perfect carriers for treachery. The Venetian poison wine killed quietly, hidden beneath the sweetness of Malvasia or the spiced heat of a mulled red. The medieval fish of death could fell a man before he had time to rise from the table, his final thoughts perhaps of how fine the feast had been. And in the end, that was the cruelest twist. In these stories, the dead were often not denied pleasure, but given it in abundance until it destroyed them. Under the low flicker of candlelight, the long tables of Renaissance Europe gleamed with silver dishes piled high with sugared fruits, marzipan swans, and rosewater jellies. These were not mere confections, they were declarations of wealth and power. To serve sugar in such abundance was to show that your reach extended across oceans to the colonies and ports where sugarcane was cultivated and refined. It was the taste of empire itself, crystalline and intoxicating. By the mid-15th century, Portuguese traders had brought sugar from Madeira and Brazil, and the Spanish from their Caribbean holdings. Venice, already the jewel of Mediterranean trade, became the beating heart of European confectionery. At the grand wedding feast of Duke Alfonso d'Este in 1502, guests did not simply eat sweets. They wandered through entire landscapes sculpted from sugar, castles and fortresses whose turrets were filled with perfumed creams, each bite dissolving into luxury. Yet the glittering substance that adorned these tables was already sowing its own quiet ruin. When sugar first became common among the elite, physicians believed it to be medicinal, prescribing it for coughs, stomach disorders, and even melancholy. Catherine de' Medici's apothecaries sent her sugared lozenges daily, while Elizabeth I of England adored candied violets, preserved ginger, and sugar subtleties shaped into mythical beasts. But the very delicacy that symbolized refinement began to rot the bodies that consumed it. By her later years, Elizabeth's teeth were so blackened with decay that foreign ambassadors remarked upon it in their reports. Venetian diplomat Giovanni Michiel noted in 1557 that her teeth are very black, a defect the English seem to take little notice of. Behind the courtly smiles lay abscesses, gum disease, and infections that caused chronic pain. Modern science now tells us that this indulgence also led to diabetes and other metabolic diseases. Forensic examinations of royal remains, such as those of Anne of Austria in 2013, have revealed calcifications and tissue damage consistent with diabetes complications. Her letters speak of constant thirst, fatigue, and sores, symptoms easily recognized today, but in her time attributed to the mysterious toll of age. She, like many in her position, had been famed for her love of sugared almonds and candied orange blossoms. If sugar was the slow poison, lead was the swift one. Its deadly journey through European dining culture began in ancient Rome, where wine was sweetened by boiling grape must in lead vessels to create supper. This syrup, lead acetate, had a pleasing taste but was a potent neurotoxin. The practice endured into the Middle Ages and Renaissance, when sugar of lead was deliberately added to sour wine to improve its flavour. The 15th century German housebook of Wolfegg Castle even listed lead acetate as a common wine corrector, a deadly recipe written without a hint of suspicion. One of the earliest documented poisonings from this practice occurred in Augsburg in 1696, when several noble families fell ill after drinking Rhenish wine doctored with lead acetate. Victims experienced severe abdominal pain, paralysis, and eventually death. Dr. Eberhard Gockel recorded the tragedy in Tractatus de Veninis, linking lead in wine directly to fatal illness. In 1487, in the city of Ulm, a bishop's wine steward was accused of killing 6 banquet guests. He defended himself by claiming he had only mended the wine. In the usual way, whether out of ignorance or malice, was never settled. The Republic of Venice, ever conscious of both prestige and political survival, issued a ban in 1560 on the import of wines treated with the sugar of Saturn, Saturn being the alchemical name for lead. This came after 3 ambassadors nearly died following a state reception. The official explanation blamed corrupted casks, but merchant testimony pointed directly to lead additives used before shipment from Crete. Still, the ban was imperfectly enforced. In 1575, several Venetian nobles fell ill during the feast of San Marco after drinking Dalmatian Malvasia wine, a scandal quietly suppressed to protect the city's reputation. In many courts, sugar and lead met in the same deadly cup. Sweet dessert wines like Sack, Muscatel, and Malmsey, prized by the English Tudors, French Valois, and Spanish Habsburgs, were frequently improved with lead acetate to intensify their flavour. Guests might finish a banquet with candied fruits and a goblet of lead-sweetened wine, unknowingly dosing themselves with 2 poisons at once. The poor, unable to afford such luxuries, were spared this particular fate. In a grim twist, the most lethal foods of the age were reserved for those at the very top of society. This slow poisoning left its mark on history in subtle ways. Chronic pain, strange illnesses, sudden collapses, and shortened lifespans plagued the courts of Europe, often hidden behind silks and ceremony. The archaeological record confirms what the whispers of chroniclers suggested. In 2010, skeletal remains from Renaissance and Baroque crypts in Poland, Austria, and Italy were found to have lead concentrations far beyond modern safety limits. Researchers concluded that wine more than cookware or glazed pottery was the primary source. Similarly, dental analysis of rulers like King Ferdinand II of Aragon showed enamel wear, decay, and gum disease consistent with a lifetime of consuming refined sugar. The irony is sharp. Sugar and lead were not the exotic poisons of whispered assassinations, but everyday indulgences. They were embraced, celebrated, and displayed at the most important tables in Europe. In the flicker of candlelight, as musicians played and goblets clinked, the nobility toasted to their health with drinks that eroded it and reached for confections that were quietly undoing them. Death came not with a bitter taste, but with the sparkle of sugar crystals and the golden glow of wine. The banquet table was both stage and executioner, a place where opulence and decay sat side by side. Those who feasted under its light believed they were enjoying the very best life could offer. In truth, they were drinking and eating the most elegant poisons of their age. The vast interior of the Renaissance Vatican was often cloaked in incense, candlelight, and ceremony, a place where the sacred felt untouchable. Yet even here, in the holiest rituals of Christendom, whispers of poison drifted through the marble corridors. In the Borgia era, when politics and piety wove together into a web of ambition, the Eucharist, the consecrated bread, believed to become the body of Christ, was not always beyond suspicion. Rumors, persistent and dangerous, claimed that popes and cardinals themselves had turned the holiest of wafers into instruments of death. In the reign of Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, such stories multiplied. His enemies accused him of plotting to rid himself of rivals, not with armies, but with the chalice and the paten. One tale, repeated by chroniclers hostile to the Borgia name, described a banquet where select guests, including wealthy cardinals, were served wine and communion wafers laced with a subtle toxin. The aim, it was said, was to seize their property and benefices after their untimely deaths. Whether this particular account was truth or propaganda remains debated. The Renaissance was fertile ground for both political murder and politically useful lies. But it was not impossible. The concept of poison hidden in a wafer was chillingly practical. A small, paper-thin host could be infused with powdered toxin, masked by the slight sweetness of the bread, and swallowed without suspicion. The fear of poisoned communion was not limited to the Borgias. In medieval chronicles from France and the Holy Roman Empire, bishops and kings occasionally accused their enemies of attempting such a crime. In 1329, Guillaume de Nogaret, a French statesman, was rumoured to have died after taking the Eucharist at the hands of an unfriendly cleric, a suspicion impossible to prove, yet never quite dismissed. The genius of the method lay in its invisibility. The act looked like salvation, but could conceal damnation. Beyond the marble halls and papal intrigue, another danger lurked in far humbler settings, one that struck with neither malice nor political cunning, but with ignorance. In Europe's fields and gardens, countless edible plants grew alongside deadly mimics, and for centuries the untrained hand could gather both into the same basket. Hemlock, with its lacy white flowers, was the executioner of ancient Greece, famously ending the life of Socrates. But it also thrived along the hedgerows of medieval and Renaissance Europe. To the untrained eye, young hemlock leaves resembled those of parsley or wild parsnip, especially before the plant flowered. In an age when fresh greens were a rare and welcome break from winter grains, foragers could mistake a sprig of poison for an herb meant to flavour a salad or pottage. The result was almost always fatal. In 1676, records from Suffolk, England, describe a tragic incident when a family, eager for the first greens of spring, unknowingly added hemlock to their salad. Within hours, their limbs grew heavy, their speech slurred, and breathing slowed until death claimed them all. The local physician, examining the remains of the meal, recognized the plant only when it was too late. Similar accidents were recorded in rural France, where hemlock's resemblance to harmless cow parsley led to entire village households perishing after a shared dish. Wild parsnip carried its own dangers. While its root was edible when cultivated, wild varieties could cause blistering skin reactions when handled, and some contained toxins capable of causing nausea, delirium, and in severe cases, death. In 1731, a German court chronicle recounts the story of servants preparing a herb feast for their lord's return. Wild parsnip leaves, mistaken for a common salad green, were mixed into the bowl. By nightfall, half the household was gravely ill, and 2 did not survive the week. The tragedy of these salad deaths lay in their innocence. No assassin's hand was needed, only the misstep of a gatherer, the similarity of one leaf to another, the failure of knowledge passed from elder to child. In a way, these deaths were crueler than the deliberate poisons of courts and cloisters, because they carried no intention, only the weight of human error. When seen together, the whispered Eucharist murders of the Borgia era and the fatal foraging mistakes of rural Europe, the danger of food in history reveals its full range. Poison could be a tool of the powerful, hidden in the holiest ritual of the church, or it could lie waiting in a patch of weeds, needing no plot to claim its victims. In both cases, the act of eating, meant to nourish, became an unknowing step toward death. And as the centuries passed, the memory of these dangers persisted in ghost stories, in warnings told to children, in the lingering suspicion that the meal before you might not be as innocent as it seemed. In the cathedral and in the cottage, the table could be an altar or a trap. In the grand feasting halls of Europe, fish was more than food, it was a symbol. For the wealthy, serving exotic catches and delicacies from distant coasts was a display of status as much as taste. Yet beneath the polished silver platters, danger sometimes hid in plain sight. Preservation methods were imperfect, seasons were unforgiving, and the very waters that provided these prized dishes could turn treacherous. Few understood how quickly a delicacy could become a death sentence. Salted herring, for centuries a staple of trade in northern Europe, was a prize commodity in the diets of nobles and merchants alike. Caught in vast shoals off the coasts of the North Sea and Baltic, the fish were cleaned, salted, and packed into barrels for transport to markets hundreds of miles inland. The Hanseatic League built fortunes on herring, and Lent with its ban on meat made the fish even more valuable. But there was a flaw in the system. If the salting was poorly done, or if barrels were left in damp conditions, the fish could begin to rot long before reaching the banquet table. Records from Lübeck in the early 1500s describe an infamous shipment of herring that arrived in the city looking pristine, but inside the barrels, decay had already begun. At a feast hosted for visiting envoys, the fish was served without suspicion. By the following morning, several high-ranking guests were violently ill, and at least 2 died within days. The city's chronicler noted the strange swelling and blackening of the bodies, a grim sign of foodborne botulism, though the term would not exist for centuries. Similar incidents pepper-caught histories from Denmark to the Low Countries. Salted fish that turned rancid, killing not only the poor who bought it in bulk, but occasionally the elite, whose wealth could not shield them from bacterial decay. The danger was not limited to preserved fish. In coastal courts from Portugal to Brittany, summer feasts often featured shellfish, a sign of freshness and abundance. Crabs, lobsters, and oysters were considered luxuries, especially when served in inland palaces far from the sea. Yet shellfish carried their own invisible threat, toxins from microscopic algae that thrived in certain waters. These poisons could survive boiling, baking, or steaming, making even the most carefully prepared dish lethal. One of the most notorious shellfish poisonings in recorded European history struck the French court in the summer of 1626. The Duke de Montmorency, a nobleman of high standing, hosted a lavish coastal feast for visiting dignitaries. Among the centerpiece dishes was a mound of freshly caught crabs, their shells gleaming red under candlelight. Guests cracked claws and sipped wine, praising the sweetness of the meat. But within hours the laughter faded to confusion. Stomachs cramped, faces flushed, and a sudden, paralyzing weakness spread through the hall. Some could not breathe without assistance. Montmorency survived, though gravely ill for weeks. Others were not so fortunate. Their deaths whispered to be the work of assassins, though physicians, unfamiliar with marine toxins, could offer no proof. In England, the summer of 1793 brought a similarly grim story from the coastal town of Weymouth. A fashionable gathering of local gentry feasted on crab and lobster hauled in that very morning. Yet, as the sun set, violent sickness swept through the guests. 3 died before dawn. The local surgeon, bewildered, could not find any visible cause. It was only centuries later that scientists would identify the likely culprit, paralytic shellfish poisoning, caused by dinoflagellates in red tide blooms, which the shellfish had concentrated in their flesh. What made these deaths particularly haunting was the sheer opulence of the meals that caused them. Salted herring in a gilded hall, crabs served on silver trays, both were symbols of refinement, proof of a host's wealth and reach. Yet in each case, the danger lay beyond human control, hidden in nature itself. Salt could fail, barrels could leak, tides could shift, and unseen toxins could flourish in the sea. The people of the Middle Ages and Renaissance may not have known the science, but they knew the risk. Folklore and superstition surrounded fish and shellfish, with some coastal communities declaring certain months unlucky for harvest, or warning that shellfish taken in warm weather could turn the blood thick. These old sayings, often dismissed as peasant wisdom, sometimes hid a core of truth. The summer months did increase the likelihood of algae blooms. Fish caught too late in the season were more prone to spoilage. Still, the lure of the delicacy was stronger than the fear. Kings and dukes continued to serve salted fish and shellfish at grand events, trusting the skill of their cooks and the loyalty of their suppliers. For some, that trust proved fatal. The fish and crabs that arrived at their tables gleamed like gold, but the riches they offered were poisoned. And so, in the annals of Europe's culinary history, salted herring and shellfish stand as reminders that luxury can carry its own invisible dagger slipped between the courses of a feast. Under the golden glow of candlelight, the great banquet halls of Europe became theatres of power. Every dish was a statement of wealth, of influence, of mastery over resources others could scarcely imagine. But among the roasted meats, sugared fruits, and delicately spiced stews, some of the most dangerous threats to life came wrapped in the least suspicious form: pies and pastries. In an age where food was not just nourishment but a political weapon, the dessert course could be the deadliest moment of the night. In the courts of France, pies were a centerpiece of aristocratic dining, not the humble, open-faced pastries of peasant kitchens, but elaborately sealed, ornamented marvels, their crusts shaped into intricate designs and gilded with egg wash. To break open such a pie was to break into a treasure chest of flavor game birds, spiced meats, or custard spilling forth. But to a skilled assassin, that sealed crust was also the perfect cover for powdered poisons. Slipped in after baking through a tiny incision, the crust resealed so neatly that only the sharpest eyes could detect the tampering. One of the earliest documented cases comes from the mid-16th century, during the reign of King Henry II of France. Court gossip whispered that a certain noble, too openly critical of the crown, was invited to a private supper at which he was served a royal pie. That night he was racked with agony, his lips tinged blue, and by dawn he was dead. The official cause was apoplexy, but chroniclers later suggested a darker truth, that powdered arsenic had been dusted into the meat filling, chosen for its ability to dissolve without altering flavor. In the cutthroat politics of Renaissance France, a pie could be as efficient a weapon as a dagger. It was not only in France that pastry played the role of silent executioner. In the Venetian Republic, where poison was elevated to an art form, the The kitchens of the nobility were rife with suspicion. Venice's infamous Council of Ten, the shadowy body responsible for state security, is said to have sanctioned poisonings as a tool of diplomacy. Pastries, particularly cream-filled confections, were ideal vessels. Their rich, sweet flavors masked the bitter edge of certain toxins, and their perishability provided an easy excuse should the victim die. Spoiled cream was a believable story in a city where summer heat was relentless. The darker edge of pastry lore emerges vividly in the so-called assassination by dessert plot of 1660, whispered about in English court circles. According to an account preserved in the diary of a minor nobleman, a political rival of the Duke of York was invited to dine at a small gathering. The final course was a custard tart, golden, fragrant, and topped with sugared almonds. Within an hour of eating it, the rival collapsed. Whether the death was truly the result of poison hidden in the custard, or simply a stroke brought on by rich food, no inquiry was ever pursued. The event entered court legend as a cautionary tale. Accept wine with caution, but pastries beware them most of all. Pies could also serve as elaborate distractions. In some cases, the danger wasn't inside the pastry at all, but beneath it. Medieval and Renaissance banquets sometimes featured surprise pies, where the crust concealed live birds or small animals that would be released to the guests' amusement. Such theatrical dishes were an opportunity for sleight of hand, a poisoned goblet placed during the commotion, or a deadly sweet slipped onto a distracted guest's plate. Feasting was a game of appearances, and in such games, death often wore the mask of spectacle. In certain regions, the pie itself became a message. Italian political assassins sometimes favored tarts, flavored with bitter almonds, their natural cyanide content providing plausible deniability, especially in small doses administered over time. This method blurred the line between murder and illness. The victim might waste away over weeks, the cause chalked up to a mysterious fever. Pastries were also employed in subtler forms of political sabotage. In 18th century Austria, there is record of a diplomatic banquet where the visiting envoy was served a series of progressively sweeter desserts. By the end of the meal, his tongue and mouth were so dulled by sugar that he failed to notice the bitter almond flavor in the marzipan centerpiece. He fell ill the next morning. The Austrians publicly mourned his passing. Privately, they celebrated a treaty negotiation suddenly freed of a stubborn opponent. What made pies and pastries particularly dangerous was that they carried no obvious stigma. A poisoned goblet could be avoided by refusing to drink. Suspicious meat could be pushed aside under the pretense of being too full. But dessert was the reward, the grand finale of a feast, the one course almost no one declined. In a world where trust was already fragile, to offer someone a pie was to place your own reputation on the line, and to accept it was to gamble that your host valued your life more than their ambitions. And yet, people kept taking the risk. Perhaps it was the allure of the golden crust, the intoxicating aroma of cinnamon and nutmeg, or the sheer impossibility of suspecting that something so beautiful could carry death. That is the irony that history leaves us. In courts where betrayal was as common as bread, the sweetest things on the table could be the most bitter to swallow. In the cold, stone kitchens of 18th century Germany, where the scent of smoke and salted pork hung thick in the air, sausages were not just a staple, they were a symbol of regional pride. Each village had its own recipe, its own secret blend of spices, its own method of curing and smoking. But beneath the pride and tradition lurked a silent killer, one that gave the world a word still used in medicine today: botulism. The name comes from the Latin botulus, meaning sausage, a grim reminder of how this delicacy once claimed lives. In an age before refrigeration, meat preservation was both a necessity and a gamble. Sausages were often packed in casings and stored for weeks or months in cool cellars, but when the meat was improperly cured, or the storage environment too warm, it became the perfect breeding ground for Clostridium botulinum, a bacteria that produces one of the most potent toxins known to man. The first recorded outbreak of sausage-related botulism struck in the early 18th century in the Württemberg region. A local festival turned to tragedy when several villagers fell violently ill after eating smoked blood sausages. Symptoms began with nausea and vomiting, but soon escalated to paralysis, eyelids drooping, speech slurring, breathing slowing. Many did not survive. At the time, physicians had no understanding of bacterial contamination. The illness was blamed on sausage poisoning, a vague term that encompassed both spoiled meat and the mysterious, invisible toxin now known to science. By the late 1700s, so many such deaths had occurred in parts of Germany that local authorities began regulating sausage making. Laws were passed dictating how meat should be handled, salted, and smoked, and butchers could be fined or worse for selling meat suspected of causing illness. Yet the cultural love for sausages was so strong that the risk never fully deterred people. In some regions, superstition even sprang up around it. The idea that a sausage could turn bad if touched by someone harboring ill will, a folk belief that masked the very real danger of poor hygiene. If sausages brought death to the table in neatly tied casings, the medieval and early modern meat markets brought it in broad daylight, and often to the poorest. In the bustling market squares of medieval Europe, the meat trade was a chaotic affair. There were no sanitary inspections, no refrigeration, no standardized butchering practices. Animals were slaughtered in open stalls, flies thick in the air, blood pooling on cobblestones. Meat that could not be sold fresh was left hanging for days, its surface darkening, its smell turning. The wealthy could afford the prime cuts, fresh from the kill. The poor often had to settle for meat that was already past its prime, or in some cases, already rotting. But hunger drove them to buy it anyway, sometimes from unscrupulous butchers who masked the decay with heavy salting, spices, or even smoke. This not only failed to kill dangerous bacteria like Salmonella and E. coli, but often created the perfect environment for them to thrive. Records from London's 14th century markets describe stinking flesh sold to labourers who would then fall sick within days. The connection between rotten meat and illness was observed, but not fully understood. Some blamed bad humours in the air, others the wrath of God. The real culprit, microbial contamination, would not be identified until centuries later. In Paris, the problem was so widespread that municipal ordinances attempted to ban the sale of meat past the second day after slaughter. Enforcement, however, was inconsistent, and many butchers simply sold their aging meat in poorer districts where oversight was lax. The result was a recurring cycle of foodborne illness among the city's lower classes, outbreaks so frequent that they were often simply accepted as part of life. The danger was compounded during times of famine or siege, when meat preservation became a desperate improvisation. In the winter of 1420, during the siege of Melun in the 100 Years' War, defenders reportedly resorted to eating meat that had been salted months earlier and stored in damp cellars. The result was mass illness that claimed almost as many lives as enemy action. While the sausage makers of Germany inadvertently gave their deadly product a name in medical history, and the meat markets of medieval Europe filled countless graves, the two stories share the same chilling truth, that in a world without refrigeration or scientific understanding, meat was never just meat. It was a gamble, a roll of the dice between nourishment and the silent creep of poison into the blood. Even now, in an age of strict hygiene laws and advanced preservation methods, the legacy of those dangers remains. The very word botulism is a reminder that one of the deadliest toxins known to science came not from a lab, but from a kitchen, wrapped in the comfortingly familiar form of a sausage. And in the shadows of history, the bustling markets and festival tables still whisper the same warning, that the richest flavours sometimes hid the bitterest ends. In the sunlit mornings of Victorian Europe, the breakfast table seemed an image of health and domestic comfort. Porcelain cups, silver spoons, and pitchers of milk sat beside warm bread and jam. Milk was considered one of the purest, most nourishing foods, perfect for children, invalids, and the elderly. But beneath its creamy surface, it carried a silent, invisible killer: disease. In the 19th century, before the invention of pasteurization, milk was often drawn from cows kept in unsanitary urban stables. Many of these animals were underfed, diseased, or milked in filthy conditions. The result was milk that teemed with bacteria, and in an age before germ theory was widely accepted, nobody understood the danger. Tuberculosis was one of the deadliest culprits, spreading quietly through raw milk. Families could be struck by the disease without ever suspecting its source. One infamous outbreak occurred in the 1850s in London's crowded slums, where hundreds of children died after drinking milk from cows suffering from bovine tuberculosis. The deaths were slow and agonizing coughing fits, wasting away, and eventual organ failure. Physicians noted the link between certain dairies and sickness, but without the ability to see bacteria, the idea that milk could spread disease remained controversial. It wasn't until Louis Pasteur's work in the 1860s that heating milk to kill pathogens became an accepted practice. Until then, every glass poured was a gamble. Milk could also carry typhoid fever, scarlet fever, and diphtheria. In Manchester in 1873, an outbreak of scarlet fever was traced to a single dairy whose milk had been stored in wooden churns, rinsed with water from a contaminated well. The disease spread rapidly across households, killing dozens within weeks. The poor often bore the brunt of these outbreaks, buying milk that had been watered down and often contaminated in the process to make it more affordable. If milk was a hidden carrier of sickness, honey had its own more exotic and ancient danger. Along the rugged shores of the Black Sea, in the mountains of Pontus, modern-day Turkey, bees fed on the nectar of rhododendron flowers. The honey they produced contained granotoxin, a potent neurotoxin. This mad honey looked like any other, golden and inviting, but those who consumed it suffered dizziness, vomiting, fainting, and sometimes death. The earliest recorded account of mad honey poisoning comes from 401 BC, when Xenophon, a Greek soldier and historian, described how his troops, retreating after a failed Persian campaign, found beehives along the coast and indulged. Within hours, soldiers were staggering, unable to stand, their vision blurred. Some collapsed unconscious, and although most recovered, the episode left them vulnerable to enemy attack. A more deliberate use of mad honey as a weapon occurred in 67 BC, when King Mithridates VI of Pontus reportedly ordered hives placed along the route of invading Roman soldiers. As the Romans consumed the honey, they became incapacitated, making them easy targets for his forces. Centuries later, in the 18th and 19th centuries, European travelers to the Black Sea region wrote of locals selling honey that could make the strongest man fall as if drunk. Even in small doses, it could cause alarming drops in blood pressure and irregular heart rhythms. The toxin was resilient; it could survive in stored honey for months, making every spoonful a potential threat. Mad honey occasionally made its way into European markets through trade, often as an exotic delicacy. Unsuspecting buyers might add it to tea or spread it on bread, never knowing that its sweetness concealed a toxin powerful enough to drop an army in its tracks. Thus, in the annals of European food history, both milk and honey, symbols of purity and abundance, became grim reminders that even the simplest, most wholesome foods could harbor death. For Victorian families, the milk jug on the table could carry the plague into the nursery. For ancient soldiers, a spoonful of honey could turn a march into a massacre. And for all of history, the lesson lingered: the sweetest and most trusted tastes are not always the safest. In the gleaming banquet halls of Europe's courts, almonds were a treasured delicacy. They arrived in shipments from the Mediterranean, perfuming kitchens with their sweet, nutty aroma. Roasted, sugared, or ground into marzipan, they graced royal tables from France to Austria. But hidden inside the heart of the bitter almond, a cousin of the sweet almond, was a deadly secret: cyanide. Bitter almonds contain amygdalin, a compound that, when digested, releases hydrogen cyanide, one of the most lethal poisons known to humankind. In large enough quantities, it could kill within minutes, shutting down the body's ability to use oxygen. In the Renaissance, when food was as much a tool of intrigue as sustenance, this made bitter almonds both a danger by accident and a perfect weapon when wielded with intent. Royal kitchens had to distinguish carefully between sweet almonds and their bitter cousins, a task complicated when shipments arrived mixed. In smaller amounts, the almond's bitterness could be masked by sugar, wine, or cream, and this is where assassins found opportunity. In 17th century France, the Marquise de Brinvilliers, infamous for her poisonings, was rumoured to have experimented with almond-based confections laced with arsenic and cyanide. Sweet-smelling marzipan could be served with a lethal twist, its fragrance masking a mortal dose. Accidents, too, claimed their share of lives. In 1837, several children in England died after eating almond cake prepared from a batch of ground nuts bought cheaply at market, later found to be heavily contaminated with bitter almonds. Even the scent of cyanide in high concentrations, often described as like almonds, became a grim shorthand for poisoning in both courtrooms and crime novels. If almonds were the stealthy killers of the dessert table, champagne offered a more glamorous but equally dangerous path to assassination. Sparkling wine had become a symbol of celebration by the 18th and 19th centuries, flowing at royal weddings, diplomatic feasts, and victory banquets. Its pale gold bubbles seemed the very essence of luxury, but in the hands of those with murderous intent, a flute of champagne could be turned into a silent weapon. Arsenic was the poison of choice for many in this era, cheap, tasteless, and easily dissolved in liquids. In 19th century Russia, rumours swirled that political dissidents and rivals at court sometimes met their end with a poisoned toast. One of the most infamous cases, though never conclusively proven, was tied to the court of Tsar Alexander II. A visiting diplomat fell violently ill after a banquet, his symptoms matching acute arsenic poisoning. The champagne served to him had been poured in the kitchens, out of sight of the guests. In France, police records from the mid-1800s detail an incident in which a wealthy merchant was murdered by his own nephew, who slipped powdered arsenic into his uncle's champagne during a New Year's Eve gathering. The bubbles, far from betraying the plot, helped disguise the powder's presence and aided in its rapid spread through the drink. Even when not deliberately poisoned, champagne and other wines could carry toxic risks. Bottles stored in lead crystal decanters for long periods absorbed enough lead to cause chronic poisoning. Wealthy households, prizing their ornate crystal, unwittingly dosed themselves over years, the metal leaching into their prized vintages. The combination of almonds and champagne, sweet and sparkling, decadent and refined, could, in certain hands, become an assassin's perfect pairing. A royal feast could end not in merriment but in gasps for breath, the toast to health becoming a sentence of death. And in the candle-lit courts of Europe, where power shifted on whispers and glances, no sip or bite could be trusted entirely. In the long winters of Europe's famines, bread was often the only thing keeping people alive and, tragically, sometimes the very thing that killed them. When harvests failed, grain became scarce, and bakers were forced to stretch what little they had with whatever could be ground into flour. In the Great Famine of 1317, millers mixed rye and barley with ground bark, straw, and even sawdust to produce something that resembled bread in form, if not in nourishment. The result was often indigestible, sharp-edged, and capable of causing fatal intestinal damage. During the famine winters of the 17th century in Scandinavia, famine bread was baked from moss scraped off rocks, dried nettles, and lichen boiled to soften their bitterness. These substitutes lacked any real nutritional value, and worse, many contained toxins that weakened immune systems. In Norway and Finland, famine bread, made from lichen and bark, was recorded as causing severe stomach cramps and slow starvation, as bodies burned through their reserves to process food that gave no sustenance. But the most sinister famine bread came when desperation met mold. In Eastern Europe, rye tainted with ergot fungus, the same toxin behind St. Anthony's fire, was still milled into flour during bad years. People, already weakened by hunger, found themselves in the grip of violent hallucinations, burning sensations in their limbs, and gangrene that blackened and rotted their fingers and toes. Death could come swiftly or in a slow, agonizing decay. If bread was the false promise of life during famine, cabbage, that most humble of vegetables, could carry death into even the healthiest kitchens. Cabbage was a staple across Europe, prized for its ability to grow in poor soil and survive cold weather. But its very toughness meant it could thrive near contaminated water sources and in the crowded, unhygienic cities of the Middle Ages that often meant human waste. Typhoid fever, a bacterial infection spread through fecal contamination, found an easy pathway into households through cabbage washed in polluted rivers. In the late 1800s, outbreaks in urban England and Germany were traced back to vegetable markets that purchased their produce from farms downstream of city sewers. Housewives, thinking they were feeding their families something wholesome, were unknowingly serving disease on a plate. One documented case from Hamburg in 1892 describes a cholera outbreak that swept through the city, killing thousands. While most of the blame fell on the drinking water, investigators noted that cabbage and other leafy greens from surrounding farms, irrigated with the same infected water, had helped spread the disease rapidly. Poorer districts, where cabbages were eaten raw or lightly boiled to save fuel, were hit the hardest. Even in rural France and Italy, cabbage grown in fields fertilized with night soil, the euphemism for human excrement, carried unseen dangers. Without proper composting, pathogens survived in the soil, clinging to the vegetable's tightly packed leaves. The risk was greatest in autumn, when cabbage harvest coincided with the end of the hot summer months, allowing bacteria to flourish. Bread and cabbage, one the symbol of survival, the other of thrift, both turned into killers when famine, poverty, or ignorance set the table. In desperate times, they showed how food could become not just the solution to hunger, but the very instrument of mortality. In the great banquet halls of Europe, silver was more than tableware. It was a statement of wealth, refinement, and power. Goblets, platters, forks, and spoons gleamed under candlelight, their polished surfaces reflecting the prestige of the noble houses that owned them. But what the aristocracy didn't know, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that this symbol of elegance was slowly poisoning them. For centuries it was believed that silver was pure, even medicinal. Physicians recommended drinking from silver cups to ward off illness, and alchemists praised the metal's supposed purifying properties. What no one understood was that silver tarnishes when exposed to certain foods, especially acidic ones like wine, vinegar, or citrus, leaching trace amounts of the metal into the meal. Over years of daily use, these traces accumulated in the body. By the Renaissance, symptoms of chronic silver exposure, now known as argyria, began appearing in the high-born, bluish-grey skin, chronic fatigue, digestive distress, and neurological problems. The cause was a mystery. Some blamed the vapors of luxury, others whispered of curses or divine punishment for excess. In truth, the very vessels used to serve their delicacies were quietly dosing them with a toxic metal. Worse still, much of the so-called silverware in grand houses was not pure silver, but an alloy containing lead. This made the items more durable and cheaper to produce, but introduced a second, deadlier toxin. Lead causes organ damage, memory loss, infertility, and in children developmental delays. In noble courts where children dined from the same ornate plates as their elders, the effects could be devastating. By the 18th century, the link between tableware and illness began to be suspected, but tradition and pride ensured that silver dining endured long after the dangers were known. If silver was a slow, silent poison, simple, humble eggs could deliver death in a single meal. For most of history, eggs were considered safe, even restorative, a symbol of life itself. Yet in royal kitchens, where delicacies were prepared in vast quantities for banquets and feasts, the humble egg became a silent killer when contaminated with salmonella or other bacteria. In an age before refrigeration, eggs spoiled quickly, especially in the heat of summer. Once a single bad egg entered a custard, a sauce, or a pastry, it could infect dozens, even hundreds of people. Royalty, accustomed to rich egg-based dishes like omelettes, quiches, and sweet creams, were particularly at risk. One of the most striking examples comes from the court of Austria in the late 18th century, where a summer luncheon served to visiting nobility ended in tragedy. The culprit, a grand dessert of iced zabaione, made from eggs that had been stored too long in a warm pantry. Several guests fell violently ill within hours. 2 never recovered. The event became a whispered cautionary tale in Viennese kitchens, though official records downplayed the cause to summer sickness. An even more politically charged case is tied to the French court in the years before the Revolution. A breakfast served to a visiting minor prince allegedly resulted in a severe bout of food poisoning from tainted eggs in a cream sauce. Though the prince survived, the scandal added to the growing perception of court incompetence and decadence. It was said that if the monarchy could not even serve safe food to its allies, it deserved neither loyalty nor respect. In both cases, the lesson was the same. The dangers of food in history were not always exotic, rare, or obviously deadly. Sometimes they were hidden in plain sight in the silver goblet raised in a toast, or in the golden yolk of a breakfast egg. And in the courts of kings and queens, where meals were a performance of power, such quiet poisons could shape not only the health of rulers, but the course of history itself. The hall is empty now. The fire in the great hearth has gone cold, and the air smells faintly of old ash and stone. Candlesticks stand like sentinels, their wax long hardened, the drips frozen in place as if time itself has stopped. The great table stretches from end to end, its scarred oak surface marked by centuries of feasts and by secrets no one speaks aloud. If you were to run your fingers across it, you might feel the ghosts of meals past, the faint grain of bread baked with ergot, the sticky sweetness of wine laced with lead, the faint tang of salted fish turned sour in the summer heat. Every scratch, every stain, is a quiet reminder that what feeds us can just as easily undo us. In the candlelit courts of kings, food was never just food. It was a language of wealth, of politics, of love, of vengeance. A poisoned goblet could be a political coup. A spoiled banquet could shift the balance of alliances. Even the most innocent dish could be a weapon when ignorance and ambition sat at the same table. And it wasn't always malice. Sometimes it was simply the age itself. A world without refrigeration, without germ theory, without the chemical understanding to know that the sweetened wine was sweet because of arsenic, or that the shimmering silver plate was slowly lacing every bite with metal. History remembers the grand gestures, the coronations, the treaties, the wars, but rarely the quiet, intimate betrayals that happened over dinner. We forget the courtesan who smiled over a goblet of poisoned champagne, the priest who whispered blessings over tainted bread, the noble child who never woke from a fever born in the royal kitchen. Now the hall sleeps, and the shadows in the corners seem to lean closer, as if listening for the clink of goblets and the murmur of guests. The plates are empty, the glasses dry, but the stories remain not in the cookbooks or the records of state, but in the strange way certain names linger in history, to remembered for the way they died, as much as for the way they lived. And as you step back from this table, from these centuries of danger disguised as hospitality, perhaps you'll carry the same quiet awareness that haunted those who lived it, that every meal is a gamble, every bite a choice, and that in the grand banquet of history, not everyone leaves the table alive.